Hey guys, I don't have a reselling video this time or a health video this time. As you can guess, we are going to be 3D printing a little project. I'm going to walk you through everything I did and in some cases why I did it. I hope you like it. I'm basically going to show you how I went from this to this. And this is Repetier Host. It's the program I use to actually connect the computer to the 3D printer. I blew it up as big as the printer would allow, and I even put it on an angle so I could make it a little bit bigger. And here the process is called slicing, which basically converts the model to lines that the printer will follow. And now the printer is just starting at 0, 0, and 0 on all three axes, because it has to know where the bed is. And this is just a purge line. Basically cleans out the nozzle, gets some fresh filament through there, and then it starts the outline of what is called the brim. The brim is a type of adhesion assistance. It basically makes 4 or 5 outlines before it actually starts printing the piece itself. And that just helps it stick to the bed a little bit better. The whole piece took about 6 hours, 6.5 hours if you include the cool down time. I actually allow it to cool down on the bed itself, and then it just pops free. Otherwise, if you try and pry it off, it tends to warp. After it cools, that's what we get. I'm just rubbing my fingers over top of it, looking for any little bits that need to be trimmed off. You can see the brim there needs to be trimmed off all the way around. Now this printer doesn't make everything silky smooth when it finishes. Usually there's little nubs here and there that I have to cut off. But what do you expect for $200 at a garage sale? Now I'm trying to show you what is called stringing. It's basically when the nozzle moves from one flame to the other flame there. You can see little bits. It's called stringing. I'm basically going to burn that stuff off with a little butane torch. And now we start painting the yellow on the letters. We've got a project, of course. Then we have some cleanup water. A cleanup cup. A mixing cup. A popsicle stick for mixing. And the paint itself. I'll also be putting in some Pearl X Brilliant Gold Pearl Glitter. I use this stuff when I color my epoxy, but I won't be using it in the epoxy in this project. It's actually makeup tint is what it is. And we got some blue shop towels for cleanup. I actually prefer to use blue shop towels over conventional paper towels. They just work way better. And there's some alcohol swabs to clean up some of the tight areas that I have to paint in. I'm just adding a little bit of water to help thin the paint out a little bit. I don't want it too incredibly thin, because this white plastic will show through quite a bit if it's too thin. The plastic is actually PLA. That's the filament that I'm using. It absorbs moisture very well. So this water-based acrylic paint actually takes to it really, really well. You can see I'm using a lot of pearl. And I'm using the pearl just to help the paint pop a little bit. Like when the light hits the yellow or the sun hits it, it'll just help bring it out. on the outside of all the letters before I do the top face of it. And I'll actually be hitting the top 2 more times, be 2 extra coats. Now we start with the red around the letters. Of course, got some cleanup water and a cleanup cup, a mixing cup, popsicle stick for mixing. That's the applicator syringe I'm going to be using. Some red paint. And some pearl white pearl glitter. And of course some blue shop towels. And I thinned the paint out a tiny little bit because I actually have to suck it up through that little syringe. If I tried that without thinning the paint out, it would not have worked all that well. And at this stage, I'm not so much painting as I am flooding. I'm basically flooding a thick layer of paint around the letters. And I did that to somewhat hide the 3D printed surface. It's actually somewhat similar to welding, to MIG welding. You make a puddle and then you just kind of push it along, coax it along. a day and a half, 2 days later, because I wanted to make sure that all the water was out of it. You don't want to trap any water underneath the epoxy. And that's a mixing cup and 2 measuring cups. Some popsicle sticks for mixing. And the epoxy itself. I use Envirotex brand. It's the best epoxy that's available in my area. And some rubber gloves for this job. And of course, some Blue Shop towels. I love these mini red Solo cups for this, just because of the lines, the measurement lines that are put into the red Solo cup. I just put the mixed epoxy into a little squeeze bottle. And I just want to fill it up just to the point where it's contoured but it's not overflowing. I'm not going to overflow the edge until the next step. So I'm basically just going just above the letters in the outline. Now I'm just using a flashlight to look at the meniscus. I have a little butane torch, that is to get all the bubbles out. A combination of the heat and the CO2 pulls the bubbles up to the surface and pops them. It's actually pretty cool. It's ready to go to bed for 2 days. And here it is 2 days later. And I've got my GoPro clipped to a baseball cap. That's why it's different lighting, different camera. That's why it looks so different. I do apologize for the angle. It wasn't quite, the camera wasn't quite aimed quite right. Now this is just the flood coat, so I can do all the mixing in a mini red Solo cup. It'll just take a little longer to mix it. Epoxy projects can be made or lost in the mixing process alone. So whenever I mix the epoxy, it's a minimum 2 full minutes. Now I'm just hitting it with some sandpaper, some fine grit sandpaper. I believe it was 320 grit. And that just helps it get helps the new layer of epoxy have a mechanical bond with the old layer, essentially. And then I just hit it with an alcohol swab to clean up the dust. Prop a flashlight in there, and that's when I tilt the camera up. I'm not being too incredibly neat. I'm just pouring some on there because it's going to pour over the edge. I want it to coat the edge. And I'm using a paintbrush that I broke the handle off so it would fit inside the cabinet without too much trouble. And I'm just using that brush to make sure all of the surfaces are covered. And then when I'm happy, I hit it with a little bit of fire to pull the bubbles out. And it helps self-level it a little bit as well. You can see it dripping on the side there, So I'm just going to take a popsicle stick and scrape the drips off the side. I guess after I use the brush. I'll actually be coming back off camera for the next 3 hours. Every hour I'll be scraping the drips off because it'll continue to drip off. And that just cleans up the bottom to make it easier later. You'll see. And it'll sit in that cabinet for 2 more days.
Don't stop. Don't stop. Don't stop. Don't stop. Don't stop.
You can't really see it on camera, but there are quite a few micro bubbles that came out during the first coat. I believe that was from the air coming out of the plastic itself, because it's not completely watertight or airtight. And there you can see the back, the efforts that I made to keep all the drips off of it as it was curing helps at this point. Otherwise I'd have to take a knife and scrape all that hard epoxy off. It's not fun. So that's a base that I had 3D printed itself, and I will be using a plastic coat hanger to mount the logo to the base. And the tools I'm using are a pair of side cutters and a Dremel. And of course, I got my extra large coffee. And here I'm pretending the edge of the table is essentially the top of the base. And here is where I realize that the coat hanger is solid towards each end and is hollow in the middle, in between each end. So instead of using one hollow piece and one solid piece, I went to the other end so I can have solid pegs. Now I'm just shaving down the edge of the pegs so they're somewhat reasonably flat. And I just grind through the epoxy because with the super glue that I'm using, it actually reacts with the PLA and melts it. So if I just grind through the epoxy and apply the super glue directly to the PLA on the logo, it will make that joint in fact stronger than the plastic around it. I didn't measure anything, I've just more or less eyeballed everything. That's my webcam mount that I'm using to hold the logo upright as the glue dries on the pegs. More than one use out of it. And there we go, after a day of curing. So now it's time to paint the base. I was going to go with a gold base, but after some thought, I figured yellow and red would be better. So we got our paint, we got a little cup, and we got some cleanup water. And an applicator syringe that you saw earlier. It's just got a flat point on it. Tiny bit of water. It ended up being too much water, so then I had to add a whole bunch more paint. Because it had to be thick enough to cover the top of the base, but it had to be thin enough where I could bring it up into the syringe. Same thing here as I did with the red on the logo. I'm pretty well just flooding the entire top with the yellow paint. Let that dry for a day. Now here's where I actually use a paintbrush again. And I wanted to get everything red between the yellow and right down to the bottom brim. And I wanted to leave the base, that lip at the bottom, I wanted to leave that white. I figured that would tie it all together, tie the whole thing together nicely. And I actually went back half a day later after this and put another coat of red on the base. Because a little bit of the white plastic was coming through yet. And an alcohol swab just cleans that lip off a little bit. And then that sits for a day. Alright, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I enjoyed creating. And I'll see you next time.